Actually, it was at the Mycenaean Seminar that I began, that I gave one of my very first lectures. And that was a long, long time ago, of course. But, I was a young architect then. I was a newcomer to the family of prehistorians, and everything was so new and strange for me. And I still cherish and remember very fondly the warm welcome by Peter Warren, who, he, with his kind encouragement, along with a glass of sherry. I think you owe me another glass of sherry now, Peter. So this is, for me, really something special. So here I am again at the Mycenaean Seminar, and strangely enough, I will be addressing a question, the same question that I had at the very beginning, back then. What exactly do we expect architecture to tell us about the past? Or perhaps we should cut the question and just ask, what can architecture tell us anyway? I mean, what kind of expectations do we share when we study the architecture of such a remote and silent past? So this is the question, and let's start with our good friend Gideon, the great historian and critic of architecture, who writes that the task of architecture is to serve a way of life valid for a period. Well, that sounds great news, and very promising, because that's very much what archaeology is about. Archaeology is also trying to understand the way of life of a very specific period. So in that sense, it seems that the two disciplines, architecture and archaeology, I mean, different though they might be, they have this in common. They are both in quest of human ethos. So, well, things look quite bright, and all we need to do is find out, how does architecture serve this goal? And, well, this is where our problems begin. Because what we are actually asking is, what is the process of architectural design? Well, first of all, it is polyparametric problem solving. It starts by formulating the tasks, which means to map the needs and turn them into a building program, and then checking requirements and constraints, checking sources, availability of materials, know-how, and so on. Then making choices and decisions among a variety of options. This is a very crucial stage of the whole process, because in order to make a choice, you have to have a very good knowledge of all the alternatives so that you make sure that you make the right choice. You will see later on what I mean with this. And finally comes optimization, which means taking into account all the above. But at this point, priorities might shift around and in unexpected ways. As if this is not enough, the process of architectural design is a dynamic process. Because of architecture's capacity to absorb time and change, a building goes through many life cycles, what we call the palimpsest effect. In every such cycle, in every remodeling, every time, there is some kind of intervention on a building, be it a major remodeling project or just blocking a door, all the above process has to go through again, time and again, in a repetitive kind of way. Now, all this, the above description, it's a brief description and nevertheless rather frustrating, I'm afraid, because it only shows how complex and contradictory the design process is. This is, in fact, is something that is well known among architects, and it is reflected in the numerous theories of architectural design, numerous theories, all of which are problematic one way or another, and they certainly are inadequate when it comes to teaching on the drawing table or the computer today. So one naturally might wonder, if it's so difficult to explain the design process in its genesis, how is one expected to unfold the design process of a work of architecture that was created more than 3,500 years ago and has survived to our days in ruins through numerous modifications and distractions? Well, I'm afraid that nevertheless, this is exactly what archaeology is striving to achieve. I mean, archaeology goes the opposite direction. Starting with the finished product, it seeks to arrive at the parameters, those initial parameters that guided planning and designing in the first place, hoping that it is there where the details of the way of life are to be found. Now, the theoretical tools available to us for this kind of very demanding kind of study, fall into two general categories. The analytical, which involves statistics, mathematics, graphs, and so on, and the phenomenological or holistic approach, which is based primarily on corporeal experience. Well, I must say that my personal preference is towards the second, the phenomenology. And this is exactly the point of view that I have endorsed in the discussion that follows. To my understanding, I mean, if architecture can tell us anything at all, it is primarily what we as human beings perceive through our senses and through our emotional reactions to the stimuli of both the natural and the man-made environment. So let's start with the words of Oscar Wilde. Actually, I find that poets and writers have a very eloquent way of describing things. So in one of his novels, there is this young lady who refuses to follow the gentleman out for a walk to the forest or something, on the grounds that if nature was friendly, architecture would not have been invented, she says. Now, Colin Renfrew says something similar. Civilization, and architecture in this case, is the insulation created by man as an artifact which mediates between himself and the world of nature. Well, all that mediates, however, to separate, is also a means to communicate, to join. Hence, the communicative role of architecture is of great importance because it announces identities and intentions. And I must say that the same goes for clothing. I mean, clothing makes the human body culturally visible, they say. This dual role of architecture, first to cut and divide and then to join and bound, is very well embodied in the archetypal figure of Daedalus, the father of all architects, so to speak. Now, Daedalus makes his appearance in Homer, where he is seen drawing a circle on the ground. What he's doing is he cuts and bounds a piece of land, transforming it into a locus, a place wherein Ariadne can perform her dance. The movement of her body is what gives architecture the third dimension of space, the vertical. So, to cut and to bound means to create boundaries. At the same time, however, all boundaries must have points of penetration, channels of intrusion and communication. Otherwise, there's no life, no afterlife, no beyond life, no life together. So boundaries and connectors are all around us and they are an essential part of our lives. Now, boundaries and connectors come in a variety of forms. This is what I mentioned in the beginning, that making choices and decisions is crucial because there's a variety of ways of creating boundaries. Boundaries can be planar, like a wall, for example. They can be single markers, like the Horus stele at the Athenian Agora, or even perhaps mason's marks carved on the walls of the palace of Knossos. Those are single markers as well. Or if you like, at a larger scale, peak sanctuaries are also single markers marking a territory. They can also be linear, just a line painted on the floor is enough to mark a boundary. They can also be mundane or spiritual, material or immaterials, explicit or implicit, or they can be combined, as in the picture we see here, where you have a tall wall, which is a real and intimidating boundary, but nevertheless, I mean, it bounds and it marks a specific property, of course. Little chapels have been adjusted to this wall to reinforce the boundary. Sanctity, in other words, is summoned as a means to confirm a mundane boundary. Rites of passage, of course, are also markers of crossing a boundary, but also games that children play. This is a picture I like very much. You see these little girls here holding hands and dancing in a circle. A circle is a perfect shape. It's the shape of equality, of equal distances, a shape that is self-defined. So these girls are sort of declaring their common identity. The outsiders are a little boy who is outsider because of his sex, and the girl here, the older girl, because of her age. Now, in fact, this game, at least for the Greek-speaking audience, we call it the Bernasquera Maria. Maria, you may pass or you may not pass. And the idea is that there's another little girl going around, and the girls here at some point, momentarily, they raise their hands and create a door, an opening, a connector. And the girl around has to be fast enough to locate this this gap and try and get inside the circle. And then she's accepted to the group of girls you see here. Anyway, I just want to say that boundaries and connectors are part of our lives in many different ways. But let's turn now to bounding elements and connectors as we know them in architecture. So bounding elements, there is the floor, which mediates between our body and the earth. And, foundation deposits are another declaration of their performance as insulators, because, they testify the presence of an otherness at the other side of the floor. Then there are the walls, which define the area of action and adhere to the verticality of the body. And the roof, which mediates between our body and the sky. And the sky is where most cultures place the dwellings of their gods. Then there are the connectors. The door, which announces the barrier, in fact. It's not the opposite of the barrier, it announces the barrier. The window, which conducts our vision. And the corridor, which is an elongated threshold. And the staircase, a door in the vertical. So let's have a quick look at each one of these elements. A floor can be architecture in its own right, a threshing floor or a dancing platform. This is complete architecture. With their form and their structure, they fulfill completely the function, the purpose for which they were designed. So a floor is architecture by itself. The treatment of the floor, however, can tell us a lot about the building and how it is experienced. First of all, the floor may be flat, or it may include some depressions, like the lustral basin, or protrusions, like the raised walkways. It can also be made of clay, of beaten earth, in which case it is a weak boundary, because it's very close to nature's floor, or it can be paved. And the paved floor is much more resistant, of course. It's a stronger boundary. If paved, then again, we can see carefully what sort of pavement. This one, for example, is the crazy pattern. It's like a carpet. It's neutral, it's indifferent, and it's meant for a general purpose. So this room is for a general purpose. If you have a linear kind of arrangement of slabs, then this is more directional and it promotes movement. So it's perfect for the corridor. And what is very common in Minoan architecture is the centripetal, focused, self-contained kind of pavement with emphasis at the center. You can see it here. And this kind of pavement promotes pause and arrest. There's also the illusionary kind of treatment, alluding to the other. This could be, for example, a painted floor with, let's say, marine motifs. So there are many variations, and it's obvious that the architect who designed this building very consciously chose the appropriate treatment for each space. Now, of roofs, we have little information in archaeological records. but nevertheless enough to know that the Aegean architecture has exclusively flat roofs, whereas in the mainland Mycenaean architecture, pitched roofs seem to have been the norm. The difference between the two is actually striking and interesting. I mean, a pitched roof is a strong boundary. First of all, it holds the building together. Each building is autonomous. It emphasizes individuality. There is tension because of the oblique planes that form the roof. And also, they promote symmetry and axiality. If you look at flat roofs, then these are weaker boundaries. There is continuity in the way that the horizontal plane can be expanded infinitely, and the feeling is that of the roof resting in a passive kind of manner. Moreover, flat roofs facilitate the construction of another floor, another story, so they facilitate multi-story construction in an additive kind of way. You can keep on adding such units, whereas a building with a pitched roof, in order to acquire a second floor, it has to be divided within the area within. So you see that when you compare these different options, you have a better understanding of the properties of each one separately. Okay. All right, so let's move to connectors now. And before we start with the door itself, well, first of all, it's important to keep in mind that crossing a boundary is much more than just stepping through. It is a process that consumes time, space, energy, and emotions. I will use the words of Michaelis because he's very eloquent, and he says that approach and access is a process that mobilizes the mind as much as the body. Before overcoming the inertia of the body, it starts as a mental journey with all the senses scouting the terrain, anticipating the potential encounters one might come across along the path that is to be followed. The way, indeed, consists of a sequence of movement and pause-arrest situations that begins long before the actual crossing of the boundary and continues thereafter. The Greek language, in fact, has a very nice way of describing this sequence. It has these three words, πρόσβαση, διάβαση, and μετάβαση. The second part derives from the verb veno, which means to go. So πρόσβαση would be to go to, going toward. Διάβαση is having gone through, and μετάβαση is having gone. That's it, afterwards. Now, the configuration of the path is crucial in formulating the ambience of the way and plays an important role in the emotional predisposition of those approaching an entrance. It makes all the difference if you are approaching, walking on a flat land, or if you are going downwards or upwards, if it's steep or flat, if there is high or low visibility, if it's frontal or oblique. All these parameters are very important in evaluating the approach on an access system in a site. Now, on arriving at the entrance door, a pause is required, a pause to check and be checked. Again, architecture provides the setting and the ambience and guides body and mind. Again, you have many options. It can be flat, or it can be convex or concave, conspicuous or hidden, explicit or implicit. It can be frontal or oblique, and all these situations will provoke different kind of emotions and feelings, inviting or intimidating, austere or relaxed, exposed or embracing. And there are so many details that we miss in archaeological records. For example, this is an interesting door from Iran, where the two handles are different and they emit different sounds so as to inform the resident of the sex of the person who is entering. So this would be a male handle, and this would be a female. and Palasma's nice words, that the door handle is the handshake of the building. Now, the door is a very, very important part of the whole edifice. The door does not deny the concept of the boundary. Quite the contrary, it is part of that boundary, and therefore it serves as the key for understanding the whole question of limit and transgression, of openness and exclusion. In fact, such is the power of the door that it can stand on its own, as a marker of an immaterial boundary, as is the case here with the Japanese torii. There is no material boundary, but the gate itself is enough to make you know that there is a boundary to be crossed at this point. We have similar depictions in art, in Minoan Mycenaean art, of single gates, and I'm sure that they indicate the same thing, that you are about to cross into another state of mind. It doesn't matter, I mean, I don't know if they actually existed in reality, such single gates, but the point is that they existed in the minds of the people. Here are some examples of self-standing gates, and it's no coincidence that arches are preferred in this instead of this kind of gate, because it's much more focused. So they can be monumental, ephemeral, commemorate, and so on. I mean, the pictures, I think, they talk for themselves. Now, something very important that we tend to forget or underestimate is that every entrance is also an exit. We tend to pay so much attention on the facade, on entering a door, and we don't really see how important it is, the feeling when you are leaving, when you are on your way out. It can be indifferent, or it can be of an entirely different kind of arrangement. There are, in the history of architecture, I mean, there are many, many important buildings that have very imposing and monumental entrances, and once inside, after a while, you can't even find your way out. I mean, the exit is completely indifferent. This is precisely why the appearance of the propylon is of great significance. I believe that it is a great step forward in the history of architecture, because here you have architecture actually, giving birth to an autonomous entrance system that treats the exit the same way as the entrance. This is important. And of course, it finds its absolute expression in the classical era, in the propylea and the propyla in general. At the time, at the peak of the democracy, leaving the sacred grounds of the Acropolis meant entering the equally respected domain of the city. Now, in Minoan architecture and formal architecture, the situation is very different. Here, first of all, you have rather loose boundaries. There are not one, but several points of penetration with no clear distinction between them, which one is the main entrance and which one is the secondary entrance. This is also very well expressed in the variety of names which are used: gate, porch, propylon, and by different scholars may use different names for the same entrance, which means that there was no standard type of formal entrance, no fixed preconception for the people, for the Minoans, as to where the main entrance should be located and what should it look like. In fact, you can say that most of them are hardly an entrance as such, when they are part of the arrest and movement sequence of the urban network. So they are more like an access system rather than an entrance as such. The only architectural unit that can be recognized as presenting entrance in Minoan architecture is the single column porch. But that again is just a facade. It's not an independent unit as it is in the Mycenaean world. Moreover, The difference between the Mycenaean with the two columns and the Minoan with one column is again striking, because the two columns mean that you have an axial, straightforward movement in between the two columns, whereas here one has to choose. One has the obligation to make a choice of movement. Windows. Well, the role of the window is to provide light and air to an interior space. But there's much more to that, of course. I mean, the windows are called the eyes of the building because they frame and guide our vision. But this is a vision that is, and a gaze that is par excellence culturally defined. In Minoan architecture, the sheer number and variety and size of the windows is absolutely amazing. And almost all of these windows open onto public spaces, streets or squares or things like that, because the courthouse does not really exist in Minoan architecture, so there's no interior kind of looking into. They are all looking out into a public space. This means that visual communication between the private inside domain and public domains outside was culturally acceptable. Again, this is important information that we can take from architecture. And the same is true for those using the roofs. And we do know that all roofs were functional. There were people working, spending time on the roofs. And again, exposure to the public eye was not a problem, obviously. So here is, I mean, what architecture can tell you. Of course, the importance of the windows was, I mean, Evans did not miss this importance, and neither did Lewis Mumford, who actually says that it's a great novelty. And Evans himself, I mean, he says that's an anticipation of the modern civilized usage of windows. We should not really take them for granted, you know. They look so familiar that we tend to forget that we are looking at something very new, something very old, 2,500 years old, and something that did not really exist in the other contemporary civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. The liminal character of the window lingering between the private inside and the public outside domain is further attested with this beautiful example here, I'm sure you all know, from Akrotiri, the West House. On the upper floor, you have this window. The two jambs have wall paintings which show vases with flowers. These pictures here are obviously meant to delight not only the residents, but the passers-by as well. So it's obvious that you have a kind of openness and socializing kind of picture here. Okay, I think I will skip this one, never mind. And let's go to corridors. The word corridor derives from the Latin correre, which means to run. So it's the architecture of movement, so to speak. So a corridor can be an elongated threshold, or it can be like a multiple socket, and its role is to connect spaces which are geographically away, different, apart, but they are functionally and topologically related. Now, again, corridors should not be taken for granted. I mean, in Minoan architecture, they appear, they become much more common in the later Neopalatial era. There are many, many buildings of earlier times, or even of that era, with no corridors. In this case, the interior rooms and the location of the doors in these rooms will play the role of the corridor. I mean, much of the space of these rooms goes to communication and circulation, which means that some of these rooms, when they have a lot of openings, they can hardly host anything else but movement. Again, something that helps us understand the function of the building. The location of the doors in a room are important because they establish circulatory paths and delimit useful areas within the room. We do know that in Minoan architecture, doors are placed at the end of the wall. You see variations here and the kind of useful areas that they provide. Mycenaean architecture, on the other hand, favors doors placed at the center of the wall, which is very different. I will not go into details, but I mean the difference is quite obvious again, and obviously meaningful. All right, so let's move to staircases now. The sheer number of staircases in Minoan architecture speaks, first of all, of a long tradition that goes hand in hand with multi-story construction. But there's much more to that. We often see staircases, first of all, a lot of staircases, too many staircases in a compound, like the domestic quarters here at Moussos. 3 staircases are too many for this area. So when you have this kind of situation, then staircases are treated like doors, actually, connecting functionally related spaces that are superimposed. 3 staircases are necessary because each one corresponds to 2 rooms. It functions like a door that connects this room and the room above it. And that goes for the others as well. Whereas if each floor had a different function, I mean, they're not related with the function of the floor below or above, like in the west wing here, where you have the storage areas on the ground floor and canonobile on the upper floor, then in this case, 1 staircase would be enough. So again, if you see this kind of situation, architecture can tell you something about how, it cannot tell you everything, but it can be very helpful in understanding how this compound functions in relation, as opposed to the other one over there. Okay, so at this point, let me make a very brief comment on ergonomy. Ergonomy is the quantitative aspect of architecture, is taking care of the efficiency of dimensions in relation to the human body and the task involved. This is in fact something that students of architecture learn from the very beginning. And this book, Neufert's Architect's Data, is one of the first books that they will buy. Well, nowadays, of course, they will find it online. Well, it's worthwhile having a look at this book at some point. You know, it's amazing. It has any kind of dimension that you may come across, anything that you can imagine, from the size and the dimensions of a donkey, and when it's holding 2 baskets, let's say, in case you are about to design a barn or something, up to details of airplanes and airports and so on. It's an extremely useful handbook for all architects, and all architects have this kind of book by their sides. Now, if you look through this book and you come to staircases, you will see that there are many, many details, many more than in other cases, because indeed it's very difficult to design and calculate properly a staircase, because it's not only a matter of efficiency, it's a matter of safety as well. And if I may, I'd like to tell you just a story, a small story that, you know, from the past has somehow reminded me of the staircases now. So I was in the first years of my life at Akrotiri, and I was working late at night. So the night guard came in, and sort of a little embarrassed and shyly, he said, "Can I ask you a favor, please?" I said, "Of course." So he said, "Oh, well, you know that I have 3 daughters, and I started, they're young, you know, but I started building houses for them. It's okay, I have no problem build a house, but I cannot calculate the staircase properly. That is something I cannot do." So, of course, we sat down together. I told him how to do it, and I did it for him actually. But that's just to show that he can build a whole house, but he cannot calculate properly a staircase. It's very important because it's really very dangerous if it doesn't work properly. There are so many staircases, in Minoan architecture, and it's really worthwhile studying them carefully and see how all these ergonomic details are taken care of. Just to take one of the many properties of a staircase, which is the inclination, the slope. This again is it's important, and steep stairs address the heart. That's Palasma talking now here, whereas gentle stairs echo the rhythm of our lungs. Actually, you have all walked up this staircase at Festos, and you do have the feeling. You cannot just do it quickly. You have to take time to climb up such a staircase. One skips up a narrow staircase, but strides up a broad one. So all these are parameters that are taken seriously into account when designing a staircase. And I am absolutely certain that Minoan architects were fully aware of all these details one way or another. Okay, and here comes now the big event, what I understand as the most innovative Minoan idea, and that I call, let's say, multiplication. We will see it in many other examples later on, but here, dealing with staircases, what we see is that there is the unit, which is a flight of steps with a corresponding landing. Then there is a proper, this kind of staircase that we well know. But then you have all sorts of varieties, starting with just opening a door at the middle landing, which means giving opportunity to connect with another level here. And then they become more and more complicated by just adding this unit in various combinations. The result is unbelievable in terms of what we might call complexity, but that's complexity to our eyes alone. What these multiple staircases do, in fact, is that they ensure quick and direct communication between related areas distributed in several levels with no crisscrossing and with minimum interference among zones. Now, this means that, circulation within the building can be controlled in a kind of hierarchical kind of way. It is a three-dimensional circular system that allows for unobstructed, synchronic use of the building by people of different identities involved in varying tasks. What I mean is that if this is the entrance, let's say, and you are a visitor, you might use only this part of the building. If you want to go to the storage space of this building, you might go up the first flight, open a door here, find another staircase, go down and go there. Or I can't go on because it becomes too complicated. But again, I emphasize that it's not complexity, it's multiplicity of choice. Complexity is to us because we do not know who are these people using it and what are their different tasks. So to me, this kind of the multiple staircases and the idea of multiplication of a simple unit is brilliant, really. There are many, many examples, just one here, Tilly, where you have a kind of a battery. You have the backbone of the building, which consists of corridors and staircases, and it controls all the circulation and all the intercommunication of the building. So I believe that they have really exercised with much mastery the idea of connectors and combined connectors. And of course, if we are talking of multiplication, here is multiplication at its best, the pier and door partition or the polytheon. This is the absolute connector. This is a mutable barrier. This is multiple choices of alternative interconnections, control and regulation of climatic conditions. This is important. And Walter Graham mentioned this from the early times. It's fluidity of space, articulation and circulation. This is truly something magnificent as a concept, as an idea. And just, it's what I call the dimmer effect, because depending what's open and closed, you get such a variety of situations. How does this work? Well, the unit A is the door itself. If you multiply the door, and you can multiply it by 2, 3, 4, up to 7 times, I know of a polytheron that has 7 doors, then you arrive at the polytheron. This was possible, of course, only when the technicians, the architects, realized that they could produce a 3D timber frame that could stand on its own and bear the loads of the wall. So from unit A, the door, we come to the polytheron. Then the polytheron becomes a unit in itself, unit B. And if you multiply it and use a lot of polythera, then you get the polytheron hall. This is 63 at Acroperithera. You see how many polythera is at the ground floor. There are as many on the first floor and as many on the second floor. There are about 15 different polythera here. And there's more, because we know that the polytheron is used especially in the Minoan hall, which is a very recognizable Minoan architectural unit. So the polytheron goes along with the Minoan hall, and then the Minoan hall becomes a unit in itself. And if multiplied, and this time multiplication is exercised by overlapping such Minoan halls, then you get sets of Minoan halls or multiple Minoan halls. Excuse me. Here, for example, you have 2 Minoan halls overlapping, or in this case, you have 3 of them, Knossos and Malia. Or if you look at the little palace, then you have as many as 5 Minoan halls. I mean, can you imagine what it would be like if all the 26 doors of this compartment were left open? And this would be a very large, very broad, semi-open, sheltered area, which would be a true delight. Okay, so now if you're wondering how many combinations you can have, with all these doors, here are some calculations that can blow your mind, really. First of all, we should remember that each door has 2 leaves. They are double leaves doors, all of them. So even one door has 4 possibilities, both closed, both open, left open, or right open, and so on. So even starting with one door, you have 4 combinations. As you multiply them, the numbers increase, impressively. So if you have a polytheron made of 4 doors, you have 256 combinations. And if you start working with multiple Minoan halls, then you can arrive up to almost 17 million combinations. This is truly amazing. Now, well, okay, I have included this little picture just for the fun of it, and just say that 3,500 years later ago, after the invention of electricity, the needs remain very much the same, and I'm referring to bioclimatic needs. And the answer to our needs is very much the same. It's only technology that differs. I don't know how many combinations there are in this building, but it couldn't be very far from the 17 million combinations of Minoan polytheron. Okay, I think you got the idea, so I'll just turn it off. Of course, the moment that they realized that multiplication was an answer to many of their problems, they came up with other uses as well. There is the pier and cupboard partition, where you have multiple cupboards or multiple windows. So that's again multiplication. The other very interesting and important thing is that multiplication brought about standardization and prefabrication. If you think of the example of 63 I mentioned before, that has at least 12 pier and door partitions, which all of them are very much the same. They have stone bases and they have timber elements above. Then what you need is 120 orthostrads, timber beams, that is, 96 longitudinal ones, 120 transverse beams, and 60 stone bases. Now, I think that you can imagine how important these calculations are for a work site, for organizing a work site, and for the logistics of this work site. So standardization and prefabrication are already making their presence in Minoan times. And here's another example of standardization and prefabrication. These curvilinear stone bases, which you know well, they were found like this at Arhanes, which is a very nice example because it shows the variety of their uses. They can be used as a basis to hold this tripartite platform, for example, or a table, or a base, or whatever. The thing is that they consist of units which are more or less identical. And as a matter of fact, I mean, this kind of form is, as far as I can tell, really difficult to cut on a stone. But nevertheless, they have cut quite a number of such bases available for many different uses and purposes. Okay, we're coming to the end now, and what I hope we have managed to some extent to do is to highlight some of the architectural choices, I insist on this word, that formulated the Minoan built environment, mostly at its acme, of course, the Neopalatial period. And I insist on choices because in order to understand, or have a better understanding of the choices, you have to look at other alternatives, what was rejected in order to prefer this choice. Then we have speculated tentatively on the people's response to this environment, based on the phenomenological presumption of the universality of the human body, of course. But, however, I'm not sure that we have come close to answering our question about the way of life. We're still a bit far from actually adding people to the picture. So what was the function of this room? What was its purpose or destination? What was it meant to serve? How did people use it? But also, why do we need so many different words to ask the same question? Well, at this point, I think we need to discuss a little bit the word function, the most common yet elusive word in archaeological studies. The word function derives from the Latin functio, which back then meant performance. It's no coincidence that the word function or functio does not appear in Vitruvius' work. Vitruvius' books are handbooks meant for practicing architecture. So they are concerned about the use, the stability, the form, whereas function, as it was meant, as the meaning of performance, is something else. The word retained the meaning of performance until the late 19th century. And until then, a phrase as such, I mean, an edifice should fulfill its function, would mean the moral obligation of the totality of architecture, its duty and character fitting to its destination. In other words, it had socio-political and cultural values. Function until then had an all-inclusive meaning that referred to ethos. Now things changed radically in the 20th century when the modern movement took the lead. The modern movement promoted the usefulness as the primal goal and introduced mechanistic analogies in architecture. And little by little, from function as the overall ethical performance of architecture, we turned to function as synonymous to use. Moreover, the famous dogma, form follows function, implied a deterministic, ahistorical, and a cultural notion of use, which undermine the subtle nuances of function. This form follows function dictum, I think it caused a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of confusion, because somehow subconsciously we tend to believe that if form follows function, then form should lead to function. But that's far from being true. form is not transparent to function. You can describe the form of this item here, a table, but that alone will not tell you of its function or of its many different functions. So form is not transparent to function. And this is why we resort to adjectives today to clarify the sort of function we mean. We say ritual function, symbolic function, practical function, which might mean use, and so on. Now, one reason for this is tolerance and capacity of architecture, which means the potential of a work of architecture to receive contents and serve lifestyles beyond those for which it was initially programmed. This is a church, or rather this was a church, and yes, this is a swimming pool today. Now, these characteristics, tolerance and capacity, are a gift to archaeology as much as a curse. It's a gift because it enables us to perceive and understand the dialectics of permanence and change, and to place ourselves in the continuum of culture and time. And it's also a curse because it results in an inextricable scheme of successive planning, designing, constructing, using cycles, each corresponding to a different period of time and a different way of life. Palimpsest effect, of course. So if form is not transparent function, then also meaning is not inherent in forms. Meaning is culturally constructed through use. So don't ask me what is the function of this room. It is the function that the users, the actors, if you like, add to a very plain and simple space cell, which is the case of many simple village houses in many parts of the world. If there are no contents in here, you can really have no idea of its multi-purpose function. All right, so we have come to the end. So yes, I think we do deserve to have great expectations from architecture. There is a lot we can learn, as long as we mind our steps. You can read it, so I will not repeat it. Thank you very much.